On today's video, I'm going to be giving you a preliminary evaluation of the damage done by Hurricane Helene in the state of Florida. On Friday, September 27, the state of Florida wakes up to evaluate the damage of the previous day. As far as areas affected, this has been the largest storm surge that I have ever witnessed in the state of Florida, expanding from the Florida Everglades all the way to the Florida Big Bend region. This is the coastline that was affected by Hurricane Ian's storm surge. In comparison, Hurricane Helene had storm surge basically throughout the entirety of the West Coast. Highlighted in orange is the urban area that was affected by Hurricane Ian. Highlighted in purple are the urban areas that suffered hurricane storm surge from Hurricane Helene, a vastly larger area. So while Hurricane Helene wasn't as destructive as Hurricane Ian, it left a storm surge from the Florida Everglades, Everglades City, and Naples, going all the way up to the Big Bend region and affecting the entire Tampa Bay area. This is the causeway to Anna Maria Island. We left the island before the storm surge came in, but we're seeing now that the island will actually be closed for outsiders. Holmes Beach Police Department has issued a statement letting the public know that they will be closing the island to everybody, and when residents are allowed to return to the island, they will require a pass. This basically mirrors what happened on Fort Myers Beach, where the Lee County Sheriff's Office prevented media outlets from going on Fort Myers Beach and getting footage of the island so that only the Sheriff's Office could be the only source of information on what was happening on the island. Now, I believe that Lee County did that in order to prevent media outlets from coming on the island so that they could be the only official source of information about what's happening on the island, since it seemed like the Lee County Sheriff, who's now being investigated by the FBI allegedly, was making an effort to basically control the situation and, well, garnish for himself attention by preventing media outlets from going onto the islands. I hope that isn't what they do here, because basically with Hurricane Ian, I wasn't able to get any footage of the aftermath immediately afterwards because the Lee County Sheriff's Office didn't allow media outlets on the island, saying it was unsafe, but then they took advantage of the fact that no media outlets were allowed on the island so they could 100% control all of the media footage coming off the island. It's almost like if the police became the news, kind of like what they do in Russia, or in Venezuela, or in North Korea, where the state becomes the only source of information. I hope they don't do that here, but it's possible that I won't be able to get footage from anything off the islands for a while. They're practically using the same exact vocabulary that the Lee County Sheriff's Office used referring to Fort Myers Beach. But the intention of that was, again, that their sheriff was trying to keep media outlets out so that him and Ron DeSantis could do all the press conferences and they could garnish the attention they wanted. So you have to understand that part of the intention of keeping the media off of Fort Myers Beach for a while was simply the intention that they had to have exclusivity over the content coming off the island. But we understand basically that a storm surge came over Longboat Key, came over Anna Maria Island. St. Petersburg Beach and Clearwater Beach suffered greatly as well. So we understand that the coastline will have a long period of recovery. And this is disastrous for Southwest Florida and the entire Tampa Bay area, an area that's economy is solely based off of tourism. This storm is going to cost the state of Florida more than you could imagine. Hospitality, taxi drivers, shuttle drivers, anybody working in restaurants, anybody that depends on tourism in Florida is at the end of the dead tourist season. We are starving in Florida and waiting for the tourists to come so that people that work in hospitality can make money. Imagine now that the entire west coast of Florida will be devoid of tourism because all the coastline was affected by a storm surge. Sure, some beaches will be able to clean up before the tourists arrive, but a lot of the large tourist attractions like Clearwater Beach, Anna Maria Island, Sarasota, these areas could see the tourists quite literally not show up this year. And again, we just went through a horrific dead season. The off season was horrible. And people that live in this area, depending on tourism, were waiting for those dollars from tourism to come in and subsidize their living. In other words, this is disastrous for a metropolitan area of Tampa Bay that heavily depends on tourism. With the entire west coast of Florida during hurricane cleanup, we're going to see tourists go to the Florida Panhandle and the Florida East Coast, or Orlando or Southeast Florida. When we saw Hurricane Michael destroy Panama City Beach, places like Anna Maria Island took a lot of the tourists that used to go to the Florida Panhandle, and now those tourists come to the Sarasota area. What's happening now is going to be bad for Western Florida. Basically, all the tourists that would have came here are going to go to other places. And if they like those other places more, they may not return to west coast of Florida. In the past, storms like this have affected a region of the western coast, but this is the first time that the entire west coast of Florida will be having hurricane cleanup. Basically, all of western Florida is going to be suffering greatly, and it's questionable whether in a very short period of time these beach towns are going to be able to clean up before the tourists arrive. If they're not able to clean up, we're going to see a lot of lost dollars in the tourist industries, which many people here depend on desperately. This is the first time in recent history that the Tampa Bay area is completely shut down along the coastline. The implications of tourism for the entire central region of the state are now hanging in the balance. Tampa Bay area hasn't had this problem. Hurricanes have affected Southwest Florida and they have affected the Florida Panhandle. This is the first time that the Tampa Bay area sees this much destruction. How long it will take to recover will mainly depend on the permitting and building departments of these areas. In the case of Fort Myers Beach, they were already slow before the hurricane, and to this day, a lot of people haven't been able to rebuild simply because of the lengthy permit process. Bonita Springs, which is adjacent to Fort Myers Beach, looks like it's back to normal because their permit process are quicker. So the question now is, will Anna Maria Island be able to recover quickly? And based off of my few interactions with the city here and local government, this is the most mismanaged area in all of Florida. This area is plagued with corruption. It's plagued with politicians that have criminal records. They're in the bag of developers, so the rebuilding process here on Anna Maria Island is going to be very frustrating. It could be that they're able to manage pulling off a quick cleanup and restoring of the island, but if I had to give you an opinion personally from what I've seen, this has to be one of the most corrupt counties with the most corrupt officials we've seen anywhere. Basically, the people in power here are only focused on protecting the interests of an elite few and a few developers, and they really have not given too much focus on managing this area properly. So if I had to give you a guesstimate, I would say that Anna Maria Island, judging by the outward appearance of the situation, is going to have a very difficult time, just like Fort Myers Beach did, in getting things done promptly, because it seems that the local officials here have other interests in mind. It doesn't seem like they care about rebuilding quickly. Longboat Key perhaps could do a little bit better. It seems like they're more efficient. The areas affected in Sarasota, I think they're more efficient. But in the case of Manatee County and places like Anna Maria Island, I do suspect that there's going to be some serious hurdles because local government here seems very ineffective. Giving you an example, I recently got a parking ticket on the island, and you cannot pay it online. I had to go into the office, and in the office, they only accepted cash, and they wouldn't give you a receipt. If that doesn't sound like a money grab, I don't know what does. Basically, this area is managed like a good old boy system, and that means that the people that are in power are not exactly the most qualified, but the most well-connected, and that's going to lead to a huge problem now. And again, Anna Maria Island has never had this problem. They've had some minor flooding always. They've always had some small storm surge, but to the scale of the destruction that they're going to see now, it's unprecedented, and that means that this area is going to have to rebuild quickly, permit processes and other city applications and utilities. It's all in the balance now, an area that is very wealthy, but at the same time, very badly managed. To make matters worse, every municipality here is its own entity. That's very different from Fort Myers Beach, where it's all one single entity. We have Holmes Beach, you have Anna Maria, you have Bradenton Beach. It should all really be Bradenton city limits, but it's not. They have all these small municipalities, and each one of them is going to have to figure things out for their own. It's not going to be one collective effort. It's going to be just one giant crapshoot of hundreds of different municipalities. And that's the same situation along the coast of Tampa Bay. That is going to lead to a very confusing issue when it comes to permit process and rebuilding, is that every single one of these cities wants to micromanage themselves. They have different laws, different regulations, and all that's going to contribute to a cluster crap of complications when it comes to rebuilding, and well, it's just a collective effort to rebuild. Tampa Bay's housing market is cooling off. Tourism has been growing, but this will deal a huge blow to tourism. We could definitely see this area take a nosedive, similar to what Fort Myers did. Fort Myers was growing and booming, and since Hurricane Ian, it's been economically stalled out. The crime rates have increased, the buyers have backed off, and the general vibe and landscape of Fort Myers has never been the same. In general, one of the biggest discomforts after a hurricane is the attitudes of individuals. Individuals who lost their homes, lose everything, end up on the streets, and other individuals, even though they're wealthy and they're insured, but the frustration of having to deal with insurance companies and find new accommodations makes people very angry. And this is kind of a normal effect after hurricane, so we can expect people here to be more road raging. After Hurricane Ian, even the sheriff's office had to make a press statement talking about how road rage had increased in the area, leading to many people getting in violent conflicts, armed conflicts on the road after the hurricane. These events tend to cause a lot of anger and frustration, and we can see how on the west coast of Florida, the vibe will definitely change. Individuals will be under more economical pressure dealing with the recovery, those who weren't insured, those who lost tourist dollars. Everybody will be under pressure. And those who lost their homes and now find themselves with nothing, many people who own beach properties that were paid off but were not insured, these individuals are going to become a complete detriment to society, and they will vent their anger and frustration in road rage acts and other acts of violence that the rest of us in society are going to have to deal with. Usually casualty numbers are kind of confidential and not spoken about immediately, but in this particular area, the locals believe that there's an Indian woman myth that protects them from hurricane damage, and many people simply refuse to evacuate. A lot of people, out of ignorance, we're going to see, I'm sure, lots of fatalities that were mostly needless, people who refuse to evacuate areas that they should have evacuated, but because they're stubborn and don't listen to anybody, a lot of people probably lost their lives. After all, the biggest toll of this hurricane will be a delayed tourist season, perhaps a non-existent tourist season for most of Western Florida. This will benefit greatly the East Coast and the Panhandle, but will be destructive for Western Florida, in particular the Tampa Bay area that depends heavily on tourism. Many snowbirds will not be deterred by this. They'll still be here, but the beaches will definitely not be as pristine. And of course, the imminent threat of red tide after these events is always an issue. Hurricane Ian was absolutely destructive in the Fort Myers area. And while we probably won't see the same levels of destruction that Hurricane Ian brought to Fort Myers, we're going to see a larger affected area. If the state is able to promptly clean up along the coast, we could save the tourist season, at least partially towards the end of the year. But we still have another obstacle to face. The municipalities in this region of Florida have never dealt with these situations. Southwest Florida and the Florida Panhandle are used to dealing with hurricanes. These municipalities have never had to deal with these problems, and they're somewhat chronically plagued with corruption and a good old boy system that really hasn't put the most talented people in power. And I'm going to guess in the following months, the incompetence of these individuals is going to shine brightly for all to see. Immediately after the hurricane, we saw huge demographical changes in Fort Myers. Particularly, Hispanics from Miami came and bought properties and rebuilt them, and the demographics changed greatly in the Fort Myers area. It is possible that many of the people who will buy these properties to restore them may not be the owners. If it becomes an issue of people selling properties because they're not able to fix them, a lot of the capital is not coming from the usual places. Snowbirds, we can see a huge demographical change, since right now most of the liquid money that's moving isn't coming from the banking systems with high interest rates. We can expect perhaps many people in Miami, real estate prices will increase there this year Remember, Miami wasn't affected, so we've already seen in Bradenton, for example, which is here in the Tampa Bay area, and Sarasota, an increase in Latino communities. Cubans and other Latinos are moving into the Bradenton and Sarasota area, changing the demographics greatly over the last 2 years. Now, if Miami were to become a hotspot this year with the people that usually go to Western Florida, we can expect the people there to sell their properties, buy properties here for cheaper with the intention of restoring these properties, and thus we can see the demographics change greatly. For example, Fort Myers, the Harlem Heights area used to be predominantly white and black. It is now entirely Hispanic. And while it's not going to make areas change completely, we can see a 15 to 20% increase of the Latino population as people in Miami will be tempted to sell their properties and move to the West Coast, buy a house here, restore it. It's unlikely that this will happen if the local labor force is able to absorb all of the rebuilding process quickly. But if these municipalities are to stall out and not get these properties permitted for rebuilding process or whatever needs to happen, if it doesn't happen fast enough, you can expect the demographics of the area to change greatly. The Clearwater area many years ago was predominantly white and today has a growing Hispanic community. So it is possible that if there's a lot of destruction and they're not able to clean up fast enough and these properties become stagnant while Miami's properties start to boom on the other coast, since all the tourism will end up going there most likely, we can definitely expect a lot of demographical changes. One of the biggest problems after a hurricane is these people here. They're traveling homeless people from other places that will come down and pretend like they're locals who lost everything. But when you ask them what schools they're from, what areas they're from, they know nothing about the area. As we know, hurricanes are a leading cause of homelessness in the United States. And an event like this will inevitably cause more people to end up on the streets. But the state of Florida already has about 100,000 homeless people. The state of Florida doesn't want to acknowledge the scale of homelessness in the state, and in just 3 days, the new homeless laws will take effect on October 1st. These are laws that are going to arrest people for camping outside. Interestingly now, thousands of people just became homeless in the state of Florida. So imagine the same day that this law takes effect, prohibiting people from sleeping and camping outside, there are thousands of people finding out that they just recently became homeless. The timing of this law taking effect right after a hurricane will probably not sit too well with the people of Florida, especially those who recently became homeless because of the hurricane and who are going to have to deal with insurance companies that are already letting go of people and refusing to insure people in the state of Florida. Imagine, on top of the mess that we already have in the state of Florida with insurances, we have another massive hurricane hit the state, which is going to continue to further the insurance crises in the state of Florida, a crisis that has been fueled by the state's lack of handling of, again, corruption, allowing the insurance companies to do whatever they want and milking dry the people of Florida, not paying people when their properties are destroyed, and blaming the people for being fraudulent when in fact it's the insurance companies who are screwing everybody in the state of Florida. Over the last few years, it's become more evident than ever that part of the problem with insurance in the state of Florida is the level of corruption that the state has. So now the people who are going to end up on the streets because of this hurricane, right when a new law takes effect in the state of Florida, making you an arrestable offense for being on the streets, is not really the best timing possible. This is the aftermath of Hurricane Ian in the Fort Myers area. 2 years ago, Hurricane Ian destroyed Fort Myers. Since then, Idalia made a storm surge flood, and this area here just had 4 feet of water again. So we're starting to see now that storm surge flooding isn't a once in 10 or 20 year event. It's happening back to back in the same places, sometimes year after year, and this is going to complicate the insurance issue. Imagine these people are on their second or third time having to make an insurance claim in the last few years in the same areas. It's understandable that the insurance companies are not going to want to pay for the same thing they just paid for recently. Bonita Springs, Fort Myers, Naples, Cape Coral, these areas just went through Hurricane Ian. Hurricane Idalia flooded Fort Myers Beach not that long ago, and here we are again for a third time. This is going to be very complicated and difficult for the locals to manage with the insurance policies and getting paid for the destruction. We also saw that the water quality in Southwest Florida was never the same. The water is contaminated. It hasn't been aqua crystal clear turquoise color anymore since the hurricane. It's been a disgusting brown color. And well, the quality of water affects tourism as well. This year, the beaches here in Bradenton and Sarasota have had the worst water quality ever. The tourists have noticed it. Now, before tourists noted how beautiful the water was here, this year tourists are noting how bad it is. And as an Uber driver along the beaches, I've noted that many people are telling me they're not going to come back. The water quality here isn't the same, and this hurricane could agitate that situation seriously. We recently had Hurricane Debbie as well that flooded the area and brought a lot of contamination. So these back-to-back hurricane events are going to cause an ecological effect that translates into tourist dollars disappearing. The state of Florida has invested into tourism more than ever, and these events put a huge stop on the tourist industry. So we can see how Florida is becoming an even more difficult place to manage. Cost of everything expensive, incomes disappearing, industry struggling. This is the reality of Florida right now. And this hurricane will have a lasting impact on the state of Florida, a long and slow impact. In the Naples area, houses along the beach got a few feet of water. While that isn't the massive destruction of a 9-foot storm surge like Hurricane Ian, but a foot of water inside your home still means hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages for these larger properties. Money that will have to come from the insurance companies that just recently paid for this. It's going to be a very difficult and complicated situation. And Maria Island in particular has a lot of mobile homes. And while these mobile homes were probably going to be intact, after all, the wind wasn't that bad. Wind damage is usually what destroys mobile homes. You do have to consider that both Manatee County and Pinellas County have a lot of people who live in mobile homes. These aren't exactly expensive areas. Naples has a lot more money. Naples and Fort Myers are areas where there's a lot of money. But when you enter places like St. Petersburg, Bradenton, these aren't wealthy areas. These aren't the types of areas that have a lot of money. When you get to Hudson and Pasco County, Hernando County, areas that had an even higher storm surge, these aren't exactly wealthy areas. A lot of these properties are just, there's no money. And when there isn't money, it leads to homelessness. An area that's already dealing with a massive homeless problem. Bradenton, St. Petersburg, most of Pinellas County, Pasco, and Hernando County are some of the areas in Florida with the highest concentration of homelessness. And while a storm surge may not leave everybody homeless, a lot of these areas that are more affordable that are suffering are going to lead to homelessness. And again, leading to homelessness in a time when people are being arrested for sleeping on the street. Definitely, this is going to be very conflictive timing for this law, and perhaps this law couldn't have come at a worse time. This footage here is of Bradenton Beach the night before the hurricane. Eventually, we'll be back on the island and see what it looks like now. Most likely, probably about a foot or two of water came through here and everything's covered in sand. Luckily, the winds were not that strong, so perhaps we can recover quickly, but perhaps not quickly enough to save a winter tourist season that the locals are anxiously awaiting who depend on these industries. And well, that is the story of Florida over and over again. And once again, Helene did cause a lot of destruction north of the Tampa Bay area with storm surge, but these are areas that are very scarcely populated. The biggest problem we're going to see is the ones that are not able to rebuild. They're going to end up on the streets, leading to a massive explosion of homelessness. It happened in Fort Myers, and it will certainly happen in these areas a little further north. The only difference is that now, with a more tyrant approach to homelessness, what will happen to the people who had a home paid off and are now seeing themselves on the streets for the first time, in a time when, again, homeless people are being treated with tyranny? Welcome to the state of Florida. And while I will work hard to get you guys aftermath footage, I want you guys to remember that a lot of these areas are not letting people go in, the media go in to get footage. And today, just about everybody thinks they're a YouTuber. So when every civilian thinks they're a blogger, most likely it's difficult for law enforcement to take YouTubers like myself seriously. But at the end of the day, I don't even try. In the case of Lee County, I didn't even try. I knew how it goes. Basically, a lot of these law enforcement agencies want to have a complete show code on the media because it draws attention to them, because many people here are just trying to postulate themselves. They're not really interested in the public. They're only interested in themselves. And, well, we're going to see them shine in their greed in the coming months in the recovery process. Because now in the state of Florida, every time one of these events happens, the language is the same exact language. What Holmes Beach said is the same exact statement that Fort Myers Beach said. And that means that these areas are not going to recover quickly. And people in local offices looking to postulate themselves are going to make lengthy press conferences back to back while preventing the media from accessing these areas, showcoding the information, taking advantage of the situation for their own gain. We saw with Hurricane Ian how the governor and as well as the Lee County Sheriff took advantage of the situation to make these lengthy press conferences every once in a while, and of course making sure that nobody was able to access these areas to get footage because they were the only ones who wanted to get media coverage for their own personal gain. The mayor of Naples was recently arrested for a DUI. Here in Manatee County, we've had people in local office arrested for a DUI. Another was arrested for stealing on camera, and well, that doesn't end there. Most of the people in local office here are, again, very inept, so it would be interesting to see how they try to take advantage of this situation to give themselves FaceTime on the news outlets out there, and of course, any law that they can put in place to keep other news outlets out so that they can be the only source of information like Lee County did is probably looking like that's just going to happen here. After all, they're using the same vocabulary. We'll see what happens, but after all, it's going to become very difficult for the people in Western Florida with this situation. A hurricane has brought a storm surge longer than any other storm surge we've seen in recent history, and to areas that have never seen this situation before. I'll work diligently for you guys to get you guys as much coverage as I can, but just keep in mind that we're already seeing the agencies up here with the same proclamations that they did in Lee County. Basically, they are going to be the news outlet, and nobody's going to be allowed in there. Lee County did it, and they took advantage of that to promote themselves heavily, and it's possible that the agencies here will do the same exact thing, putting a show code on the outlets of information after the hurricane. We'll see what happens, but again, after all, this is the way Florida works. The police will prevent people like myself, who are bloggers and news outlets, from being able to get you guys raw coverage because they want to be the official news outlet. Of course, they say it's for the safety of the public, but we know it's really because they want to take that clout for themselves. The final loop people have to jump through is permitting processes in the local building departments. And this is where their ineffectiveness can shine and where individuals can implant themselves deeply, preventing people from getting their homes back. It happened in Fort Myers Beach, and it could happen in some of these municipalities. Only time will tell. Until then, I'll keep working hard for you guys to bring you guys coverage. I'm not going to break my neck to be the first person to get some of this stuff because, after all, today everybody wants to be a blogger, including police departments. So it really is not worth the effort to compete against police departments and every YouTube wannabe blogger that's out there trying to get content first on the social media. I'm just not going to compete with them. It's not worth it. But I will give you guys a good delivery of the process of the rebuilding and, of course, what actually took place. This is a preliminary evaluation. We will see what's really out there very soon. I'm going to give you guys good, diligent coverage, but again, I'm not going to break my neck to compete against police departments to bring you guys media first. It doesn't make sense. It's impossible. And well, after all, again, everybody wants to be a blogger today. We saw people risking their lives needlessly with completely no experience on hurricanes. People out there wanting to be bloggers, putting themselves in dangerous situations. If you watch my live stream, you almost saw how a guy got hurt parking his truck underneath a tree that fell. As I screamed, he's going to get hurt. He drove off. A minute later, the tree fell, so I was during my live stream. So everybody out there wants to be a YouTuber, wants to be a blogger, including the freaking police departments. I'm not going to compete with that. So, I'm going to give you guys good hurricane coverage, but I'm not going to break my neck to compete to be the first to get everything because, after all, everybody wants to do it, so go ahead and let them.